Hello, everybody. My name is Mirko Novakovic. I am co-founder and CEO of Dash0, and welcome to Code Red. Code, because we are talking about code, and red stands for requests, errors, and duration, the core metrics of observability. On this podcast, you will hear from leaders around our industry about what they are building, what's next in observability, and what you can do today to avoid your next outage. Today, my guest is Ilan Peleg. Ilan is the co-founder and CEO of Lightrun, which is based in Israel. Lightrun is a developer-based observability tool, a continuous debugging platform that allows you to add logs, metrics, and traces to your production in real time. I'm excited to speak with him today about that topic. Ilan, welcome to Code Red.
Thank you so much, Mirko. Happy to be here, and thank you for spending the time with me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm super excited because I really love that topic. I know we have talked many times already, but I think you are creating something special here. But my first question is always, what was your Code Red moment that really brought you into that space?
So actually, it's a true story. It's really a true story. Back then, I used to work at a big cybersecurity company. And one of our new product lines that we were launching was deployed in a POC mode at one of the biggest telecom companies out there. And apparently during the POC time, the system was crashing twice a day. And we simply didn't have any clue of why it's happening. Now we had the best of breed observability in place. I can name a few of them, but Datadog, for example, and logging simply was not sufficient. And there was not any exception shedding any light about the potential root cause, and we were kind of, going in the dark. And I remember even back then I was, troubleshooting this issue for about 10 days, eventually joining some other team members to join me and help me because it became super escalated situation, and we're missing visibility. So, I wish I had a very specific log line over there, or I wish I could be able to capture a snapshot at this very specific line of code that I'm kind of hesitant of what's going on inside. And so many different assumptions that I simply couldn't verify because I was missing the right data. And actually following those tedious 10 days of, those servers being crashing twice a day without us predicting why and when, I simply reached out to my co-founder and my partner in crime, Leonid Bluestein. And we started whiteboarding, thinking, hey, there should be a much more agile way to define observability, but also consume observability from a developer perspective, because the issue was escalated quite quickly to us, developers. So actually, this red code moment eventually led to, establishing Lightrun. And here we are, almost 5 years following that moment.
Yeah, that's a great story. And I really like, as you know, I'm also an angel investor. I think you also do angel investments. And one of the things I really love about startups is when they solve a problem they had themselves, right? Because then you really understand the pain. If you have been in this troubleshooting mode for 10 days, as you have been there, and everybody's standing around pushing you, why is that crashing? Then you know it's a real problem and real pain, right? And then you want to solve it.
I used to be a developer, and for the first time, I felt like I'm super critical to the business. If I would fail, it's going to be a huge failure because it, again, considered to be and still considered to be one of the biggest telco companies out there. But at the same time, if and when I'm going to be, successful troubleshooting those issues, I'm going to save my day, going to save, this business that is suddenly at risk. So a lot of times when we talk about observability, we're speaking about resilience of live applications, live production workloads serving existing customers. So it's a bit different because it was a pre-sale process. I truly felt that I'm becoming part of the sales team in a way, supporting this transaction, at least from the technical perspective of it. It was key for everything that was laying the foundation for later, the later discussions. So yeah, exactly about that.
I think that's why I really like your approach of kind of developer-focused observability, because, one of the stories we are hearing for more than 10 years now is this shift left, right? It's kind of what you described with developers becoming more business critical, right? Because more and more tasks are being shifted left towards the developer. When I started as a developer, I coded and then I threw the code over a wall and I didn't care anymore, right? And that's not how it works these days, right? You are also on call, you have to troubleshoot, you are responsible for security, for performance,
Exactly.
for reliability, and then you need the right tools to troubleshoot, right? And to get visibility into the code when there is a problem.
Exactly, Mirko. We see that trends coming on from different like operational perspectives. Think about it that developers are the ones who build everything that is running in the cloud or infrastructure, while they're completely disconnected from the operational cost, reliability, security of those applications. So the whole idea of shifting left, not only of observability, but the whole operational context at some point is like making them much accountable first, bringing this visibility in order to be able, to become much more accountable, but then becoming much more proactive, finding issues much earlier in the software development lifecycle, hopefully before they reach production, and making the impact before they affect our customers. So I think this is one of the main principles around shifting left. Yeah, I assume we can talk about it into this conversation more.
Absolutely. I think we should start by getting an overview a little bit. I'm also a developer and I'm really technical at some point. And I would really like whatever you can tell me to understand more how it works, because I saw a few cool things like you have a sandboxed environment and you can attach to process at runtime. You can change things, add logs in your IDE.
Right.
It's automatically deployed to the code. So some really cool magical features, which I would have loved as a developer. But I also always ask myself, okay, I understand how instrumentation works, but how are they doing it, right? So how did you come up with the idea, and give us a little bit of an overview what Lightrun is and what you can do with it?
Of course. So indeed, Lightrun is about shifting left observability. Basically, observability is currently still considered to be quite of an operational practice dominated by the greatest and gigantic players such as Splunk, Dynatrace, Datadog, Elastic, and all of those. By the way, we do not claim to compete with them, but vice versa. We can definitely take you as a customer one step further in your observability maturity. But we're going to get there a bit later. But in short, we shift left observability in the sense that we bring observability data directly into the developer's IDE, where they edit their code and eventually start their coding of new features at that spot. The last year only, billions of billions have been invested by some of the gigantic players such as Microsoft, but following those, but some other great new vendors rising up such as Poolside and the likes, which are all around like shifting left and like developer-centric Gen AI solutions. So we've been here before shouting out loud that observability must shift left directly into the IDE, but suddenly it's happening from other perspectives as well. So first, it's around bringing observability directly into the IDE to make sure that, getting back to your previous point, developers are accountable for whatever is going on top of live applications. Second, helping developers to proactively define and consume observability from within the IDE against or on top of live production workloads. I will explain. As for today, developers kind of running in silos. Exactly what you just mentioned. Developers are being required to define all logs, metrics, traces, so-called 3 pillars of observability during development, then ship this code to production using CI/CD, pipelines, whatever. Then once the code is running and operating, obviously it emits logs, metrics, traces, and then the more traditional observability tools, they collect those, try to make sense out of it, analyze it, and monitor the health of your production workloads. Once things go wrong, developers are being enforced to find a needle in a haystack, assuming the needle exists. And a lot of times they compromise what's called MTTR, mean time to resolve, simply because data is missing. Developers cannot really find the right needle. This is one, I would say, symptom which leads to this compromise on the MTTR. So developers are trying to reproduce issues in their local, ephemeral, production-like environments. It's becoming much more and more complex, especially in the cloud-native era, where you have a lot of moving pieces, a lot of like non-deterministic states. So we're producing issues from a heavy production scalable environment to a local one is something that is not always possible. Or the vice versa, and the nightmare, which is called like hotfix versioning. Let's have a hotfix only for the sake of adding visibility. So basically, all of those operational processes that are happening quite daily, in the enterprise landscape, are symptoms of the non-agility of how observability is being defined and consumed, at least as we see it. So using Lightrun, we streamline the process, allowing developers to connect from within the IDE to all of those live applications running across the SDLC, starting from everything remote, like QA, staging, up until production, being able to add logs, metrics, traces to any single point of execution in real time on demand. Just choose a very specific line in your code and add this new log that is missing, add this metric that is missing, and so forth. But at the same time, while doing so, you can also streamline this data back into the IDE. So we are removing any context switch between, more like dev tooling versus operational tools that, as said before, are considered to be more like the traditional observability tools. So just to sum it up, the whole shift left approach is first about, this super expensive, I would say, real estate of the developer, which is the IDE, bringing observability there. Second, transforming observability to be not only developer native, but more like operational free, real time, and bringing it to much earlier development life cycles rather than mainly post deployment. So developers will, adopt much more of a proactive and preventive approach, not only like handling incidents much faster, slashing mean time to resolution, which is the holy grail metric of, the whole industry, but also removing or preventing those incidents before they reach production.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Totally makes sense. But so let me try to say it in my words if I understood it correctly, right? So normally if I have observability tools as I know them with agent, is it an open telemetry agent or something else, it will instrument the code based on some, I would say, global knowledge, right? This is a database call, this is an HTTP call, this is this framework, and it's very generic, right? This is called the distributed tracing. It gives you a good sense of how microservices call each other, but it doesn't really give you a sense of the exact execution in the code, right? There
Exactly.
could be different if then else clauses, right? And
Exactly.
also variables, right? The variables that you have in your debugger. And so as far as I understand is if you figure something out, I can take Lightrun, connect, for example, to my JVM. I know that there's a problem in a microservice, for example, because one of my observability told me, and then I can go into my IDE, click into that method, add logs or other things, spans, traces, and then I would get what? I would get the execution time, but I also get the variables like in an IDE, and it will show me the variables out of production.
Exactly. Think about the following kind of fact. Every developer in the world uses debugger.
Yeah.
Right. But debugger is definitely, meeting the dev local machine kind of development, I would say, requirements, but it doesn't hold for cloud native, everything that is running remotely. And we all know that development, not only production, but development is moving to the cloud itself, simply is not applicable for like using debugger for numerous reasons. Leave aside the all operational aspect of running it in production from security standpoint, reliability and so forth, which is simply not applicable. But even much earlier, it doesn't support like microservices, it doesn't support cloud native architecture, like it's mainly one-to-one in terms of like the connectivity to the process itself. Second, it halts the process, right? Like once you set a breakpoint, it breaks the service. So you cannot fully debug or gain the same debugging experience on top of live, remote, distributed applications. So what we do is kind of, at least we started with offering the first cloud-native debugger, which means setting snapshots rather than breakpoints, meaning we capture the data for you. Everything that you used to gain using a traditional debugger, you will still gain with Lightrun. We will not halt the service, we will not stop or break the service. This is how we started. This was the first feature we ever released. But then it really became like a dynamic and developer real-time observability solution by which we're adding or allowing developers to add not only snapshots, but also all of the three pillars of observability for different like troubleshooting purposes. So just to sum it up, think about a debugger-like experience for live production workloads. Adjusting it for live production workloads with everything that you can think of, like from an enterprise perspective that is more how do you guarantee safe, secured access? How do you guarantee that sensitive data? You said variables, right? A variable might be like a PII or like some sort of a serial number of a customer. You wouldn't like your developers to gain access to it. So making this, I would say, quite native approach that developers are used to when they develop their code, but extending it and making it much more reliable, widely, or I would say much deeper into the SDLC, both from the developer experience, but also from the enterprise.
Yeah, and I can see that you must go very deep into the runtime environment, right? I mean, you have to really understand the
Yes,
runtime, and it would also be very different if you do that for Java or .NET. So
exactly.
which runtimes are you supporting? I guess you probably have started with one Java or something, and then you added more. So how is that experience?
Exactly. So we definitely had to develop a proprietary agent or SDK per each runtime, because each runtime has its own instrumentation, its own bytecode mechanisms that you should write on, but also optimize those. Not all of those are optimized for like high scalable, enterprise grade, say, requirements. So as for now, we support most of the backend frameworks out there, which are JVM, Python, Node.js, and obviously .NET. Um, and most of the IDEs accordingly, meaning like JetBrains family, VS Code, Visual Studio, and so forth. To your point, it's not only about allowing developers to instrument new additional observability pillars at runtime on the fly, but it also making sure that this product first is read-only. You wouldn't like to break any SDLC principles. You wouldn't like to break any change management or any compliances. So you must verify, or we must verify, and we verify. We have some patents on that technology, which is around making sure that the product is read-only. In short, under the hood, we have literally developed some sort of a mini interpreter, which is in charge of validating that all of those changes are read-only, which is quite an interesting technology by itself.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see that. We had problems, by the way. I don't know if you ever, this is a very technical thing, but we did dynamic bytecode instrumentation also with my former product for some things, which can be tricky. And we sometimes had problems with other agents that add code also at runtime and did not do a good job. For example, be relying on fixed numbers in the thread, right? And then you add something, and then the other agent breaks because you added something and it's not correct anymore. I could imagine that somebody could run you together with New Relic or Datadog agent, and then you have two agents and both do instrumentation. Ever run into a issue with other agents?
It's not something that happened quite commonly, but I must admit that one of the key areas where we shine or what we're proud of is that simply because we deal with runtime, you need to see a lot of environments in order to have, I would say, a robust coverage of so many different edge cases uh, in that domain. So to be somewhat general here, so many different configurations, so many different runtimes, so many different, like, especially talking again about enterprises, what's happening there is, from one hand, they're still running some of the most legacy code out there, but at the same time trying to modernize. So suddenly you can support an enterprise customer, everything like from on-premise deployment with IBM stack, going back to, serverless architecture, running in AWS. So many different, I would say, configurations or permutations of configurations that you should see in order to make this solution quite robust. And I think it took us at least 2 years to get to a maturity where we feel comfortable with where we are now. And it's something that now we are super happy to be proud of, because like a lot of things cannot be tested inside.
Yeah, I mean, we always joked at in Stana because we had a few hundred customers, And I think we never saw an environment that was even similar to another environment of the customers, right? You would think that there should naturally be something like, okay, I have this Kubernetes version, this Java version, this database, and there is somehow a common stack. Nope, never ever, right? There was always something special, something different, and some edge case. And I can just second that. It took us really a few years and a lot of engineering effort from some super specialized experts to figure those things out, right? And harden the agent so that it's really working well.
Exactly. So we have quite a solid process of how we mature new releases, new features, how we, adopt some more like a progressive rollout kind of delivery. So it's becoming more and more interesting as like architecture's been like changing, ever changing. But yeah, now like Lightrun has been around for 4 to 5 years already, so we've seen, every no, not everything. This is exactly the point, but we've seen some of the biggest enterprise landscapes out there, and I think this is what makes us quite unique, like the knowledge of those specific environments for our specific context.
And so with Dash0, I've decided to go OpenTelemetry native, right? I will not develop my own agents. I will use the OpenTelemetry standard. How do you think about OpenTelemetry? How does that affect your product? Are you supporting it? What is your view on this new standard?
So we are totally aligned with this trend. First, even with OpenTelemetry, we will still face some similar changes or challenges. So the need will probably be there, and will still be a complementary solution to existing vendors that wrap together OpenTelemetry. The thing is that we're thinking about integrating with OpenTelemetry. So first, you will be able to enrich existing spans technically and add any further cardinality into it. Second, we're about to release very soon a dynamic tracing feature, which means, I think last time we met, I showed you something, but you will be able to truly define code level tracing from within your IDE, saying, hey, line 17 at file named Mirko and line 19 at file named Ilan, please capture the data over there and tie them back together under the same transaction and also connect it to a span that I'm already kind of tracking down.
Oh, nice.
The idea of adding first any further dynamic tracing using Lightrun, but also enriching existing spans is something that we are already working on here at Lightrun.
Yeah, that makes totally sense. I mean, we have this discussion also, right? There's also, we just last week had a discussion about, there's kind of, I wouldn't say it's a trend, but at least there are discussions, as always in our industry, people go from monolith to microservices. Now, first they had one monolith, then they have 1,000 microservices, then they figure out 1,000 microservices, maybe it's also not the solution. So now there's a trend that people are talking again about monoliths, right? Maybe in some cases. And to be honest, the more monolithic an application is, the less distributed tracing is really a good solution for it, right? Then you need more code level observability, which you need or which you get with your tool, right? So I can really see, I mean, there's never a black and white, right? It's somewhere in the gray zone how these applications look like, but I can totally see how you use distributed tracing to get an end-to-end view. And then if you need, you can use Lightrun to make the boxes a little bit more light, right? Get more light into the box, and that's a really cool solution, right?
Exactly. I'm gonna tell you what. Microsoft has recently released a paper by which they scan their all incidents internally, quite widely, and then they categorize those. They found out that around 30% of the incidents were code level. By the way, it was the biggest chunk, the biggest part of the rest of the cake. Obviously, the other parts were like configuration issues, infrastructure issues, network issues. So code level issues were associated as the biggest chunk. But what's even more interesting is that the TTD, time to detect or time to resolve those issues, were significantly longer in orders of magnitude. And I think it makes sense when you think about it, because like finding like what's going on wrong in your code probably requires more people to be involved, especially again if talking about the huge enterprise kind of landscape where you're having like everything from like microservices, serverless, but also to monolithic and legacy applications where some of the developers left the organization. So finding a root cause in the code level might be more complex, but also eventually pushing the change, verifying the new behavior. So I think this is something that we're quite proud of. Hey, existing observability solutions will give you a great sense of which service is probably behaving unexpectedly, some abnormalities in SLA, SLO, some alerting. So we'll guide you better of what might be the root cause, what service, what API, what gateway, and so forth. But when you truly need to debug those and go to the single line of code that eventually is responsible to the root cause, assuming it's an application level issue, this is where we shine. And basically, we kind of promise to our customers, hey, everything that is code related, this is where we can be super helpful. Again, getting back to your point, so spans and tracing will assist you in verifying which service, which component in your system, where when you need to, dig inside and find a very specific, line of code that is responsible for this issue, this is where you would probably use Lightrun.
I honestly, I would have thought that the number of code related issues would go down. How I see it is, I mean, I started in an environment where you had 6,400 kilobytes of RAM, a very slow CPU. And at that time, almost every issue was a code issue, right? Because if the performance was low or you had to optimize the code really hard, right? Really hard, like down to, I was working on 3D engines where you thought about, is a shift left faster than a multiplication, right? It's like these little things. I think you don't need that anymore, right? These days, infrastructure and memory and CPU and GPU and network is almost unlimitedly available in the cloud. And it's also super cheap, right? To be honest, compared to what it was. So I always have the feeling that people these days, they don't spend too much time anymore about thinking about the code. And they just say, okay, if it's slow, then I just spin up 3 more containers or something like that, right? But you say still a lot of issues are, maybe this comes with new issues, right? That's probably what's happening.
First, new issues and code changes. This is obviously one of the biggest reasons for issues running in production in general. But I'm gonna give you another perspective. I think whatever you mentioned is more related to performance-related issues.
Mm-hmm.
But
True.
what about business logic? What about hey, I just made a transaction and suddenly instead of 1,000 of USD, there was some business logic mistake and suddenly we just added 2 zeros. Those things are very hard to identify using traditional observability because truly need to narrow down into the very specific business logic. So this is just to give you a better sense of other, I would say, spectrum of issues that might arise that are not necessarily related to traditional observability, so-called, or performance derogations.
No, it makes totally sense. You see that I'm too much in the classical observability mindset where it's more about performance, but you're right. Especially if the data that you have, you can also check for correctness, right? Because you have the variables, you understand what's happening, and you can actually look in something is correctly executed or calculated. That comes with the granularity that you have, right?
Exactly. And in fact, we see a growth in, I would say, the need to truly look inside your code running in production because of numerous of things that are happening. For one is the reliance of third-party code or services that you consume, integrations and so forth, which means a lot of data-related issues happen only in production, live, with live traffic. Those are very hard to reproduce in pre-prod.
Yeah.
Even anticipate them ahead of time in testing because you're having millions of transactions each time you're using another kind of service for clearing purposes or for other reasons. But the whole idea is using some third parties resources, and it's very hard to mimic those ahead of time or again reproduce that in some other referral environments. So this is one thing that is rising. The reliance on either third-party code. By the way, let's talk about generative AI. Suddenly reliance on Llama Index and LangChain, for example.
Yeah.
Go figure what's happening in these black box. And the other thing is progressive delivery workflows and the whole like DevOps culture that is emerging, simply causing to more and more testing in production practices. So even before you're facing like P1 huge outage, a lot of developers are getting closer to production simply because they're rolling out their features progressively. So like they'd like to have like more dynamic nature of testing out those features, especially those that are not fully covered in testing phases before. So you're rolling out a new feature, you're rolling it out 5% of your traffic, you'd like to verify how it behaves. Code flow that behaves correctly or as expected, performance, and general correctness of this piece of code that you just push to production. So you're receiving a lot of new traffic and you'd like to verify the behavior behaves as expected. So these practices of testing in production are also in the rise.
Yeah, that makes sense. Total sense.
Yeah.
One of the things beside shift left is this high frequency of deploying code to production, right? I mean, that's something when I go back to my career, when we started, I worked for a lot of enterprise companies. You had 1 or 2 releases a year, right? And it was a very diligent process with a lot of quality assurance at the end. And then it still failed. I say, you said it like these emergency deployments, right? Or hot fixes. I mean, that was the funny part. You had 2 releases, but essentially you already had a lot of other deployments because you released something and then you had kind of a side process, which was hotfix. And then you had to hotfix a lot of stuff because it was not working as expected. But it seemed like one big release, but it essentially was already a lot.
Exactly. It's interesting because I call it, by the way, observability meets pipelines,
Yeah.
right? Like you need a way to verify that the correctness of those new features across the SDLC, especially when you just start this progressive rollout into production, and the dynamic nature of Lightrun, allowing you to add those observability pairs dynamically. You shouldn't really persist this data because you're just testing out an hypothesis. You're just testing out your existing rollout, your existing deployment, and so forth. So obviously, some of those existing like login metrics should be persisted over time for like historical reasons, purposes, for like audit, product events, so many other use cases. But everything that is related to, hey, I just had a hypothesis, I'd like to test it out. I'm not sure we'll have the same hypothesis to be tested tomorrow. I'm just, running a very specific test right now. So it's a different kind of use case. It's not directly linked mean time to resolution of like P1, P2 incidents.
Yeah.
It's more around like releasing new features confidently.
Yeah, makes sense. Gives you more security in pushing the button, right? To deploy something because you have a feedback loop now, right? Without that, you don't have that feedback loop. That makes total sense. What are the customers that are using Lightrun? Are this more enterprise type of customers, bigger ones?
Yeah. So we started with mid-market. Now we want to move fast. You want to have like fast product iterations and reach this, product market fit. So at the beginning, we started with some of the, unicorn companies out of here from Israel. But quite quickly, we started supporting some of the biggest enterprises in the world. We have a few Fortune 10 customers. One of them, I cannot name them, but we all use their products day to day. The enterprise market is interesting because, from one hand, the cycles are much longer, but at the same time, the impact is enormous. Like the scale that those organizations operate, you truly see like every minute of downtime at some of those organizations is, valued by sometimes hundreds of thousands of USD per minute.
Yeah, it's also the size and number of developers, right? Last week, I had a call with one of the big American banks, and the guy said, "Oh yeah, we have 40,000 developers." I mean, think about it, right? It's a
Yeah.
bank and they have 40,000 developers
Yeah.
coding for them. And then you understand why a developer focused observability addresses a huge market, and it's also a huge impact, right? Make those developers, I don't know, 2% more effective. Think
Yep.
about 40,000 developers,
Yep. Yep.
making them a little bit more effective or faster in troubleshooting, not losing so much time. That's a massive ROI, right? So I can definitely see how you do your sales process, right?
Yep. Exactly. In fact, I might guess who was this bank that you're talking about. I have a few names in my guest list, but the whole idea is that we're now prioritizing the financial market. We just completed some successful POCs and technical evaluations, and we're truly doubling down on the financial market simply because, like, from business perspective, their IT budgets are enormous, so the cost of downtime is enormous. But exactly to your point, employing like tens of thousands of engineers, not thousands of engineers, but tens of thousands of engineers. So everything related to accelerating productivity is suddenly becoming even more significant. MTTR and operational efficiency we already covered, quite clear to us. Like, think about like downtime of a trading or like markets or wealth management kind of systems. So the combination of all of those is simply creating a super powerful impact that we can bring. And yeah, this is definitely one of the key markets or industries that we are now targeting.
Yeah. And to finalize this conversation, I have a very specific question to Israel, right? Because it's interesting. I'm an investor also. I did some investments in Israel, and there's actually a lot of observability companies there, right? I just out of my head, Heptio, Lumigo, Corelogix, Lightrun, right? So there are a lot, and it's a pretty small place, right?
Yeah.
Especially because most of it is in Tel Aviv.
Yep.
And
Yep.
so my question is, I mean, I understand there's a lot of security coming out of the military and things, but what makes Israel so special for this type of startups? And also, because you don't have such a big market, is that something like of the secret sauce that you have to be global from day one? Because I mean, you said you sold to a few unicorns in Israel, but also there, let's be fair, you don't have too many of these large companies you can sell to. And so at the end of the day, you have to be internationally pretty quickly, right?
So I'm gonna tell you a good story, and then we can extrapolate it. When we founded Lightrun, um, one of the key areas we were looking at was like how Lightrun will be adjusted to the new cloud native era, specifically to Kubernetes. So sorry, Leonid, but I will say that here. Leonid didn't have a lot of experience in Kubernetes back then. But apparently, he just managed to develop an internal orchestration for container system inside IDF because he didn't have access to Kubernetes. So he had to develop an internal Kubernetes-like solution internally. So like in a few days, he became much expert in Kubernetes than most of the Kubernetes experts that I know. And I know quite a few. The same with some specific databases. He couldn't use some, off-the-shelf databases. So those guys at the IDF and the intelligence corps had to deal with developing their internal databases matching their specific needs. What I'm trying to say here is that as the Israeli ecosystem is proud of a lot of talent that is developing cybersecurity related, I would say, products internally in the IDF and then commercialize it. They're also proud of developing their internal infrastructure simply because they don't have any access to the internet. They don't have any access to the outside world. They don't a lot of those solutions are simply developed internally, and a lot of those, would say more like enterprise level requirements are also eventually originated at their environments without calling it an enterprise, without having off-the-shelf vendors supporting them. So they simply need to find a solution. So they find a solution and then they go outside and commercialize it. So it happens quite similarly to the infrastructure landscape. if we compare it to your point to cybersecurity vendors, cybersecurity startups that are super like shiny out of here.
That's interesting. I was not thinking about it that way. So the IDF is not using off-the-shelf components because of security reasons, probably.
It does. Sometimes it's not. For example, the very specific unit. I was not like serving. I was serving as a professional athlete. By the way, it's another story to another podcast. But my point is that asking Leonid, my co-founder, they didn't even have access to Stack Overflow. They didn't have internet, so they developed everything that they've been developing without access to the outside world. So think about the skill set they had to develop by themselves.
Yeah, that's cool, but that's a good point also for other countries, right? I'm always thinking we have these discussions in Germany, right? How can we catch up? So basically, by understanding more of the fundamentals, right? Which these days, mostly, to be really honest, you only get at the big hyperscalers, right? The really fundamentals you learn at Google, Amazon, or Meta or something, and you can't learn them really in Germany, right? Because the companies here are building on top of that stack. But what you are saying is basically because in the IDF, in some places, they have to redevelop the whole stack. You get this real knowledge about the infrastructure. And that's why there are so many startups coming there, because they just learned the hard things, right?
I would say it's a good example story of the challenges that those talented guys face quite early in their life that make them quite, talented, skilled, early in their journey, and together with some more like character-based skills that they gain quite early in their journey, the combination is eventually quite successful in creating new ventures, speaking more generally now.
Ilan, it was great talking to you. It was really fun, and I enjoyed the conversation. And I'm looking forward to come to Israel. I mean, I promise to come to Tel Aviv soon and meet, and then we should.
You know that I'm waiting for you.
grab some food and drinks. Thanks, Ilan.
Thanks so much, Mirko.
Thanks for listening. I'm always sharing new insights and insider knowledge about observability on LinkedIn. You can follow me there for more. The podcast is produced by Dash0. We make observability easy for every developer.